The last rays of the autumn sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Castle Dome, Arizona Territory, as the stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the general store. Quincy Irving squinted against the fading light, his weathered hat pulled low over his eyes as he watched the passengers disembark one by one. His heart pounded against his ribs, though his sun-bronzed face betrayed nothing of the anxiety that had plagued him for weeks. Today was the day his mail-order bride would arrive from back east. The year was 1878, and at 32 years of age, Quincy had built himself a respectable ranch 10 miles outside of town. The double I spread wasn't the largest in Yuma County, but it was productive enough to support the family he'd never had. His parents had passed when he was barely 20, leaving him to build something from almost nothing. 12 years of backbreaking work had yielded results, but the ranch house remained empty save for himself. "That's all the passengers, Mr. Irving," called the stagecoach driver, interrupting Quincy's thoughts. "No young lady matching your description." Quincy's chest tightened. Had she changed her mind? The letters they'd exchanged over the past 6 months had given him hope that Julia Adams would be different from the 2 previous women who'd agreed to marry him, only to back out after hearing tales of the harsh frontier life. "You sure, Hank?" Quincy asked, stepping closer to the coach. The driver jerked his thumb toward the coach. "Wait, there's one more. She's been mighty quiet the whole journey, hardly said 2 words." Quincy peered into the shadowy interior of the stagecoach. A small figure huddled in the corner of the bench seat, a traveling cloak pulled tight despite the lingering heat of the day. "Miss Adams," he called gently. "Julia Adams, I'm Quincy Irving." The figure stirred, and slowly a young woman emerged from the coach. Quincy extended his hand to help her down, but froze when she lifted her face to his. His stomach twisted at the sight before him. Her face, what he could see of it beneath the brim of her bonnet, bore the unmistakable marks of violence. A purple bruise bloomed across her left cheekbone, and her split lip had only just begun to heal. "Mr. Irving," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, I apologize for my appearance." Quincy felt a flash of anger, not directed at her, but at whoever had laid hands on her. He gently took her gloved hand and helped her down from the coach. "No need for apologies, Miss Adams," he said, keeping his voice even despite the fury building inside him. "Let me get your bags." He retrieved her 2 modest suitcases from the coach, nodding his thanks to Hank, who cast a concerned glance at the young woman before clicking his tongue to set the horses in motion again. In the fading light, Quincy could see Julia more clearly now. She was small, perhaps 5'2", with a slender build that made him wonder if she'd been properly fed. Despite the bruises, he could see she was pretty, with chestnut hair peeking out from beneath her bonnet and clear blue eyes that darted nervously around the street, never quite meeting his gaze. "My wagon's just down the street," Quincy said. "Are you hungry?" "We could stop at the cafe before heading to the ranch." Julia shook her head quickly. "No, thank you. I'm quite all right." Her accent was refined, Eastern Boston perhaps, as her letters had indicated. She'd written of growing up in a respectable family that had fallen on hard times after her father's death. She'd worked as a governess, she'd said, until circumstances forced her to seek other arrangements. Those circumstances now seemed painfully clear to Quincy. They walked in silence to his wagon, and he helped her onto the seat before loading her bags in the back. As he climbed up beside her, he noticed how she tensed, shifting slightly away from him. "It's about an hour to the ranch," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "The road's a bit rough in places. You let me know if you need to stop." Julia nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. As Quincy clicked to the horses and the wagon began to roll out of town, He couldn't help but steal glances at her profile. In her letters, she'd seemed spirited, intelligent, a woman who wasn't afraid to share her thoughts. The woman beside him seemed broken, frightened. They were well outside of town, the vast desert landscape stretching out around them in the gathering darkness, when Quincy finally broke the silence. "Miss Adams, Julia, if I may, I know we've only just met in person, but I want you to know something." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Whatever happened to you before you came here, whoever hurt you, that's not how things will be with me." Julia turned slightly toward him, her face half hidden in shadow. Quincy pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face her directly. With infinite gentleness, he raised his hand, hesitating until she gave a small nod. His rough fingertips brushed the edge of the bruise on her cheek, light as a feather. "Never again," he said, his voice a solemn promise. "Not while you're under my protection. Never again." The tears that had been threatening spilled over, tracking silently down Julia's cheeks. She didn't speak, but for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she met his eyes fully. "Thank you," she whispered. Quincy nodded, giving her a moment to compose herself before setting the wagon in motion again. As they continued toward the ranch, he told her about the land they were passing through, pointing out landmarks visible in the silver light of the rising moon, giving her time and space to breathe in her new surroundings. By the time they reached the ranch house, the full moon had risen, bathing the modest structure in pale light. It wasn't fancy, a two-bedroom cabin with a sturdy porch across the front, a barn and corral to one side, and a small kitchen garden that Mrs. Hollister from town had helped him plant. "It's not much," Quincy said as he helped Julia down from the wagon, "but it's solid. I built most of it myself." "It's lovely," Julia said, and for the first time he heard a hint of the woman from the letters, appreciative, observant. Quincy carried her bags inside and lit several lamps, illuminating the simple but well-kept interior. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with a table and chairs on one side and a small sitting area with 2 chairs and a bookshelf on the other. "Your room is through there," he said, nodding toward a door off the main room. "I'm across the hall. The washroom's out back. It's not fancy, but there's a pump inside so you don't have to go out for water. I'll get a fire going for hot water if you'd like to wash up." Julia nodded gratefully. "That would be most kind." While Quincy built a fire and heated water, Julia explored her new home. The bedroom was small but comfortable, with a bed covered in a colorful quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small mirror hanging on the wall. Someone had placed a jar of wildflowers on the windowsill. "Mrs. Hollister brought those yesterday," Quincy said from the doorway, making Julia start slightly. "Sorry, didn't mean to frighten you. Water's heating up. Are you hungry now? I could fix something simple." "A little," Julia admitted, realizing she hadn't eaten since early morning. Quincy nodded. "I'll see what I can rustle up while you get settled." Left alone, Julia unpacked her meager belongings, hanging her 2 dresses in the small wardrobe and placing her few personal items on top of the chest of drawers. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed her bonnet and traveling clothes, wincing as the movement pulled at hidden bruises. The mirror reflected more damage than was visible to Quincy, a necklace of finger-shaped bruises around her throat, yellowing bruises on her arms. Julia closed her eyes against the sight, against the memories of Roger Blackfield's rage, when she'd finally gathered the courage to leave after 2 years of escalating abuse. She hadn't told Quincy the full truth in her letters. She hadn't been merely a governess, she'd been engaged to the son of the family that employed her, a man who had shown his true nature only after he'd convinced her to share his bed with promises of marriage. When she discovered she was pregnant, Roger had beaten her so severely she'd lost the baby. When the family discovered what their son had done, they'd paid her to go away, to spare their reputation. The money had been enough to answer Quincy Irving's advertisement for a bride and travel to Arizona Territory, as far from Boston as she could get. She'd been honest about wanting a fresh start, about being willing to work hard to build a life together. She'd been truthful about her character and values. She'd simply omitted the darkest chapters of her past. After washing as best she could with the basin of warm water Quincy had provided, Julia changed into her nightdress and robe before venturing back to the main room. Quincy had prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread, with coffee brewing on the stove. "It's not fancy," he apologized, pulling out a chair for her at the table. "It smells wonderful," Julia said sincerely, realizing how hungry she truly was. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Quincy spoke. "I know this isn't how either of us imagined our first meeting," he said carefully. "I want you to know that I meant what I said earlier. You're safe here, and—" He hesitated. "If you decide that marriage isn't what you want after all, I'll understand. I can arrange for you to stay in town, perhaps with the preacher's wife, until you decide what you'd like to do." Julia looked up, surprised. "You would do that? After paying for my passage?" Quincy nodded, his expression serious. "I didn't bring you here to own you, Julia. I brought you here hoping we might build something together as equals. If that's not what you want, I won't hold you to it." Tears pricked at Julia's eyes again. "You're a good man, Mr. Irving." "Quincy," he corrected gently, "and I try to be. My father taught me that a man's word and how he treats others are the true measure of his worth." "Quincy," Julia repeated, testing the name. I would like to stay if you'll still have me. I meant everything I wrote in my letters. I want a fresh start, a chance to build something real." Relief washed over Quincy's face. "I'm glad to hear it, but there's no rush, Julia. We can take our time getting to know one another. The preacher comes through once a month. He'll be here in 3 weeks. That gives us time." Julia nodded gratefully. "Thank you." "Now," Quincy said, rising to clear their plates, "you must be exhausted. Why don't you get some rest? Tomorrow I can show you around the ranch." That night, alone in her new room, Julia lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert night. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. Quincy Irving might be a stranger still, but his gentle eyes and solemn promise had touched something deep within her, something she'd thought had died alongside her unborn child. "Never again," he'd said, and somehow, despite everything, she believed him. The first rays of dawn were streaming through the curtains when Julia awoke. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room confusing her sleep-addled mind. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and with them, an unexpected sense of peace. She was thousands of miles from Boston, from Roger Blackfield, from the whispers and judgment. She dressed quickly in her plain brown day dress, pinning her hair in a simple style that covered the fading bruise near her temple. Her face in the mirror looked better this morning. The swelling had gone down, though the discoloration remained. When she emerged from her room, she found Quincy already up, coffee brewing on the stove. "Good morning," he said, looking up from the eggs he was scrambling. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in some time," Julia admitted. "Can I help with breakfast?" "No need. It's nearly ready. But I'd be grateful if you'd pour the coffee." They ate breakfast together, and Julia found herself relaxing slightly in Quincy's presence. He didn't press her for conversation, but answered her questions about the ranch readily. "I've got about 200 head of cattle," he explained, "and a small herd of horses I'm breeding. The Double I isn't the biggest spread around, but it's good land with reliable water that's rare in these parts." "Double I?" Julia inquired. "Irving and Irving," Quincy explained with a small smile. My father started it and I carried on, hoped someday it might mean Irving and Irving again in a different way. Julia felt a blush warm her cheeks at the implication. How long have you been here? My parents came out when I was 10, in '56. Father had heard there was good grazing land available, and Mother was always one for adventure. They started with just 20 head of cattle and this plot of land. We lived in a tent until Father built the first cabin. The first cabin. Quincy nodded. This is actually the second house. The first burned down during a raid in '65. We lost nearly everything. Mother took ill after that, never really recovered. Father followed her 2 years later. I'm so sorry, Julia said softly. Quincy shrugged, though his eyes held old pain. Life out here is hard, but it's good, too. Honest work, beautiful country, good people in town for the most part. After breakfast, Quincy took Julia on a tour of the ranch. The barn was first a sturdy structure that housed 4 horses, including Quincy's prized stallion, Thunder, and a gentle mare he introduced as Daisy. I thought Daisy might suit you once you're ready to ride, he said. She's getting on in years, but she's sure-footed and calm. Julia eyed the horse nervously. I've never actually ridden before. Quincy looked surprised. Never, she shook her head. I grew up in the city. We sometimes took carriage rides in the park on Sundays, but that's the extent of my experience with horses. Well, there's no rush, Quincy assured her. But out here, knowing how to ride can be important. When you're feeling up to it, we can start with some lessons. The tour continued with the chicken coop, the smokehouse, the vegetative garden, and finally the corrals where several cowboys were working with the cattle. Morning, boss, called a lean, weathered man with a graying beard as they approached. This must be Miss Adams. Julia, this is Elmer Jenkins, my foreman, Quincy said. Elmer's been with the Double I since my father's time. Pleased to meet you, madam, Elmer said, doffing his hat. If he noticed her bruises, he gave no sign of it. Welcome to Castle Dome. Thank you, Julia said, suddenly self-conscious under the curious gazes of the other cowboys, who had paused in their work. Quincy introduced them one by one. Bill Thompson, the oldest at nearly 60, the Garcia brothers, Miguel and Tomas, who'd come up from Mexico 5 years ago, and young Danny Whitaker, barely 20 and new to ranch work. The boys usually take their meals in the bunkhouse, Quincy explained as they walked back toward the main house, except for Sunday dinner, when tradition has them joining us at the house. Mrs. Hollister, she's the preacher's wife, usually comes by with a pie or two. It's kind of a weekly gathering. Julia's steps faltered. This Sunday. As in 2 days from now, Quincy glanced at her, understanding dawning. You're worried about meeting people while you're still healing. Julia nodded, embarrassed. I can explain to Mrs. Hollister. Postpone. No, Julia interrupted. No, I won't hide away. I don't want to be the subject of gossip. Quincy's expression hardened slightly. Anyone who would gossip about a lady's misfortune isn't welcome at my table, Julia. But if it makes you more comfortable, I can have a word with Mrs. Hollister when she arrives. She's a good woman, a bit prone to chatter, but kind-hearted. Thank you, Julia said. I'd appreciate that. They returned to the house, and Quincy showed her where everything was kept in the kitchen. I've been batching it for years, he said with a self-deprecating smile, so things might not be arranged as efficiently as a woman would like. It's very well organized, Julia assured him, genuinely impressed with the orderliness of the kitchen. Did you do all the cooking yourself? Most of it, Quincy said. The boys take turns cooking at the bunkhouse, but I usually fend for myself here. Mrs. Hollister brings by meals sometimes, and I'm not above eating at the cafe in town when I'm there on business. Julia rolled up her sleeves. Well, perhaps I can contribute by preparing lunch. It's the least I can do. You don't have to earn your keep, Julia, Quincy said seriously. Not today, not after your journey. I want to, she insisted. I've been caring for myself for years. I'm not made of porcelain, despite. She gestured vaguely at her face. Quincy studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right. But I've got to ride out with the boys this afternoon. We're moving some cattle to the north pasture. Will you be comfortable here alone? The thought of being alone in a strange place made Julia's stomach knot, but she forced a smile. Of course. I'll be fine. After a simple lunch of sandwiches and the last of yesterday's cornbread, Quincy saddled Thunder and prepared to leave. He hesitated at the door. There's a rifle above the fireplace, he said. It's loaded. Do you know how to use one? Julia shook her head. I'll teach you when I get back, Quincy promised. Not that you'll need it. We haven't had trouble out here in years, but it's good to know. He paused, then added, I'll be back before sundown. After he left, Julia spent the afternoon exploring the house more thoroughly. The bookshelf in the sitting area held an eclectic collection of practical manuals on ranching and animal husbandry. A few dog-eared novels, a Bible, and surprisingly, a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets. She found Quincy's room tidy and sparse: a bed, a chest of drawers, a small writing desk in the corner. A framed daguerreotype on the wall showed a stern-faced man with Quincy's jawline standing beside a smiling woman with kind eyes. His parents, she assumed. Feeling suddenly like an intruder, Julia retreated to the kitchen, where she took inventory of the pantry. Quincy kept it well stocked with staples: flour, sugar, coffee, beans, rice, and preserved foods. The root cellar beneath the house held potatoes, onions, and carrots, along with jars of preserved fruits and vegetables. By mid-afternoon, Julia had cleaned the already tidy house, prepared a stew for dinner, and baked a loaf of bread. With nothing else to occupy her hands, she finally sat in one of the chairs by the fireplace with a book, but found herself too restless to read. The vastness of the landscape outside the windows both thrilled and terrified her. In Boston, there had always been people within shouting distance. Here, the nearest neighbor was miles away. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk or the distant lowing of cattle. A sound outside made her start a horse's snort, followed by footsteps on the porch. Julia froze, her heart hammering. Quincy had said he wouldn't be back until sundown, and it was barely 4 o'clock. The door opened without a knock, and a man Julia had never seen stepped inside. He was tall and rangy, with a week's growth of beard and clothes dusty from the trail. "Well, well," he said, grinning when he spotted Julia. "You must be Irving's mail-order bride. Didn't waste any time, did he?" Julia stood, backing toward the fireplace where the rifle hung. "Mr. Irving isn't here," she said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "He's expected back shortly." The man chuckled, closing the door behind him. "No, he ain't. I just passed him and his boys heading to the North Range. They'll be gone for hours yet." He took a step toward her. "Name's Hayes, Luke Hayes. I ride for the Rocking H next ranch over. What do you want?" Julia demanded, her hand closing around a heavy iron poker beside the fireplace. Hayes held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Easy, madam. Just being neighborly. Quincy and I go way back. I was passing by, thought I'd stop in, welcome you to Castle Dome." His eyes narrowed on her face. "Looks like somebody already gave you a different kind of welcome." Julia's free hand went to her cheek self-consciously. "Mr. Hayes, I think you should leave." Hayes took another step forward. "Now, don't be like that. I'm just being friendly. Thought you might like some company, all alone out here." His smile turned ugly. "Especially since it looks like you're used to a certain kind of attention from men." Julia's blood ran cold. This was familiar territory, a man testing boundaries, looking for weakness. Without thinking, she raised the poker. "Get out." Hayes' eyes hardened. "Listen here, you little—" The sound of a rifle being cocked cut him off. She said, "Get out, Hayes." Julia nearly wept with relief at the sound of Quincy's voice. He stood in the doorway, rifle aimed steadily at Hayes' chest. Hayes slowly raised his hands. "Now, Irving, no need for that. Just making conversation with your new lady friend." "Forgot something and doubled back," Quincy said, his voice dangerously soft. "Lucky thing, wouldn't you say?" He stepped into the room, keeping the rifle trained on Hayes. "You're trespassing, and you frightened Miss Adams." "Didn't mean no harm," Hayes muttered, but his eyes told a different story. "You've got 10 seconds to get on your horse and ride off my land," Quincy said. "If I ever catch you within a mile of this house again, I won't waste time with warnings." Hayes slunk toward the door, his gaze darting between Quincy and Julia. "She ain't worth dying over, Irving." Quincy's finger tightened on the trigger. 8 seconds. Hayes hurried out, and moments later they heard him gallop away. Quincy lowered the rifle, turning to Julia with concern etched across his face. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" Julia shook her head, still clutching the poker. "No, he frightened me." Quincy crossed to her in 2 strides, gently taking the poker from her white-knuckled grip and setting it aside. "I'm sorry, Julia. I never should have left you alone." "You couldn't have known," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Does this happen often? Men just walking into your home?" "No," Quincy said grimly. "Hayes knows better. He was testing boundaries because you're here now, making it clear he doesn't respect my claim." His expression darkened. "Or you." "Your claim," Julia repeated, a hint of challenge in her voice despite her lingering fear. Quincy looked chagrined. "Poor choice of words. I meant he doesn't respect that this is my home and you're under my protection." He set the rifle aside carefully. "The first thing I'm going to do is teach you how to use this. And the second is to make sure Hayes understands there will be consequences if he ever comes near you again." "Will that make things difficult for you?" Julia asked. "With him being from the neighboring ranch," Quincy's expression was grim. "Hayes isn't the owner, he's just a hand. And the rocking H and the double, I have an understanding. Old man Henderson won't appreciate one of his men causing trouble." He glanced out the window. "I need to catch up with the boys, but I don't want to leave you alone again." "I'll be fine now," Julia assured him, though her hands still trembled slightly. "I'll keep the rifle close and the doors locked." Quincy hesitated. "I could send one of the boys back." "No," Julia said firmly. "I won't be the cause of disrupting your work. Go, I'll be careful." After Quincy reluctantly departed, Julia sank into a chair, her knees finally giving way. The encounter with Hayes had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, bringing back memories of Roger Blackfield's escalating control and violence. But this time had been different. This time, someone had protected her. By the time Quincy returned at dusk, Julia had composed herself and finished preparing dinner. The stew was bubbling fragrantly on the stove, and the bread had turned out better than she'd expected given the unfamiliar oven. "Something smells mighty good," Quincy said as he entered, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. He'd clearly washed up at the pump outside. His face and hands were clean, his hair damp at the temples. "I hope you like beef stew," Julia said, trying for normalcy despite the lingering tension from the afternoon's events. "It was my father's favorite." "One of mine too," Quincy said with an appreciative smile. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It wasn't trouble," Julia assured him. "I enjoy cooking, and I wanted to contribute." Quincy studied her for a moment. "No more unexpected visitors." Julia shook her head. "All quiet." During dinner, Quincy told her about the day's work, explaining the seasonal cycle of ranching in a way that helped Julia understand the rhythm of her new home. She found herself genuinely interested, asking questions that revealed her intelligence and quick comprehension. "You've got a good head for business," Quincy observed after she'd asked a particularly insightful question about the cattle market. "Most women's eyes glaze over when I talk about these things." "My father was in banking," Julia explained. "He believed daughters should understand money as well as sons. My mother was scandalized, but he taught me anyway." She smiled at the memory. "He used to say, Julia, a woman who understands numbers will never be at a disadvantage." "Wise man," Quincy said. "What happened to him, if you don't mind my asking?" Julia's smile faded. "Influenza, 3 winters ago. My mother had passed years earlier, so it was just the two of us. When he died, I had to find employment. That's how I became a governess. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either." Her father's death had indeed forced her to seek employment. She simply omitted what had come after meeting Roger, believing his promises, the gradual isolation and control that had turned to violence. "I'm sorry," Quincy said sincerely. "Losing parents is hard, no matter your age." After dinner, true to his word, Quincy took Julia to the porch and taught her how to handle the rifle. She was a quick study, though the weight and kick of the weapon surprised her. "You've got a good eye," Quincy said after she hit the gun he'd set up as a target on her 3rd try. "Practice every day, and you'll be a fine shot in no time." As they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in golds and crimsons, Julia found herself relaxing truly for the first time since her arrival. Quincy was easy company, not pushing for conversation but responsive when she spoke. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "So different from Boston." "Do you miss it?" Quincy asked. Julia considered the question honestly. "I miss certain things, the libraries, the concerts sometimes, the sea." She turned to look at him. "But no, I don't miss Boston itself. There was nothing left for me there." Quincy nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Castle Dome isn't Boston. We don't have libraries or concerts, but we do have community. Good people, mostly. And you can make a life here, Julia. A good one." "I believe that," she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. That night, as Julia prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about the man whose house she now shared. Quincy Irving was nothing like the men she'd known in Boston. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself. In just 2 days, he'd shown her more respect than Roger had in 2 years. The thought of Roger sent a chill through her. She hadn't told Quincy the whole truth about her past. Would he still want her if he knew? Would he still look at her with that gentle regard if he knew she'd given herself to another man, lost a child? These thoughts troubled her as she drifted off to sleep, but for the 2nd night in a row, she slept more soundly than she had in months. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she felt safe. The next morning, Sunday, Julia awoke to the sounds of activity in the kitchen. She dressed quickly, choosing her better of 2 dresses, a blue cotton with white trim that had once been fashionable in Boston. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a yellowish green, easier to explain away as a mishap during travel. In the kitchen, she found Quincy frying bacon, his sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms browned by the sun. "Good morning," he said, glancing up with a smile. "Hope I didn't wake you." "Not at all," Julia assured him, moving to help with breakfast. "I'm used to rising early." As they worked side by side, Julia found herself enjoying the simple domestic rhythm. In Boston, there had always been servants in the houses where she'd lived, first her father's, then as a governess, and finally in Roger's grand townhouse. There was something appealing about the straightforward necessity of preparing one's own meals, caring for one's own space. "Mrs. Hollister will be by around noon," Quincy said as they ate. "Sunday dinner's usually at 1. The boys will clean up nice, but they'll still eat like they're starving, so don't be offended if they don't notice how good the food is right away." Julia smiled. "I'll keep that in mind." After breakfast, Quincy excused himself to tend to necessary chores, and Julia set about preparing for company. She found tablecloths and napkins in a chest in the sitting area, clearly rarely used, but of good quality. Someone had cared about such things once, probably Quincy's mother. By the time Mrs. Hollister arrived, precisely at noon as promised, Julia had the house looking its best, and a chicken roasting in the oven, with potatoes and carrots from the root cellar. Bertha Hollister was a stout woman in her 50s, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She carried 2 pies and a basket of fresh rolls. "So you're the bride," she said without preamble, setting her offerings on the table and turning to inspect Julia thoroughly. "Quincy's been corresponding with you for months, hasn't he?" "Yes, madam," Julia said, suddenly nervous under that penetrating gaze. Mrs. Hollister's eyes narrowed on Julia's cheek, but before she could comment, Quincy appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Hollister," he said warmly, "I see you've met Julia." "Just now," the older woman confirmed, turning her scrutiny to Quincy. "You might have mentioned she was injured, Quincy Irving." "It's nothing serious," Julia interjected quickly. "An accident during the journey." Mrs. Hollister's expression made it clear she didn't believe this for a second, but she merely sniffed. "Well, what's done is done. Let me help you with dinner, dear." Men are useless in a kitchen, and you're still recovering. Despite her brusque manner, Mrs. Hollister proved to be an efficient helper and a font of useful information about Castle Dome and its inhabitants. As they worked, she filled Julia in on who was who in the small community. "Dr. Wilson's getting on in years, but he's still sharp. His wife Emma runs the lending library out of their front parlor. Not many books, but she's always looking for more. The general store's owned by the Peterson family, fair prices, though old man Peterson drives a hard bargain on credit. The saloon's best avoided, of course, though I suppose Quincy might take you to the occasional dance they hold there." Julia listened attentively, grateful for the overview. When Mrs. Hollister paused for breath, she asked, "What about the Rocking H Ranch? You know the people there, Mrs. Hollister's expression soured slightly. "Old man Henderson's decent enough, but keeps some rough company. His foreman, Jackson, is a hard man and some of their hands." She trailed off, glancing toward the door. "Has there been trouble already?" Julia hesitated, unsure how much to share. "Luke Hayes paid an unwelcome visit yesterday," Quincy said from the doorway, having caught the end of their conversation. "Thought he'd introduce himself to Julia while I was out with the boys." Mrs. Hollister's lips pressed into a thin line. "That man's been nothing but trouble since he drifted into town 2 years ago. Henderson should have run him off long ago, but he's good with horses, so he stays." She turned to Julia. "You stay clear of him, dear. He's got a nasty reputation with women." "I intend to," Julia assured her, exchanging a look with Quincy. The ranch hands arrived promptly at 1 o'clock, freshly shaved and wearing clean shirts, though their weathered faces and calloused hands spoke of the hard work that was their daily life. They treated Julia with a mixture of curiosity and awkward respect, clearly on their best behavior under Mrs. Hollister's watchful eye. Julia found herself warming to them as dinner progressed. Elmer Jenkins, the foreman, had a dry wit that emerged between mouthfuls of food. Bill Thompson spoke little but nodded approvingly at the meal. The Garcia brothers conversed quietly in Spanish between themselves, but offered sincere compliments on the food in careful English. Young Danny Whitaker blushed fiercely whenever Julia addressed him directly. "Miss Adams makes a fine roast chicken," Quincy said, his pride evident. "Indeed she does," Mrs. Hollister agreed. Though you could use more salt, dear, and a pinch of rosemary wouldn't go amiss." "I'll remember that," Julia said, taking the critique in stride. "After the main course, Mrs. Hollister's apple and peach pies were served to universal acclaim. As the men lingered over coffee, Mrs. Hollister drew Julia aside. "When's the wedding to be?" she asked without preamble. Julia blinked, taken aback. "We haven't set a date. The preacher comes through in a few weeks, I understand." Mrs. Hollister said, eyeing her speculatively. "And you'll be staying here unchaperoned until then?" Heat rushed to Julia's cheeks. "Mr. Irving has been a perfect gentleman." "I don't doubt it," Mrs. Hollister said. "Quincy Irving's one of the good ones. But people talk, dear, especially when a woman arrives bearing evidence of difficult circumstances." "What are you suggesting?" Julia asked, her voice tight. Mrs. Hollister's expression softened slightly. "I'm not suggesting anything, child. I'm offering. You could stay with me and the Reverend in town until the wedding. Proper and respectable." Julia hesitated. The offer was kind and made from genuine concern for her reputation. But the thought of returning to town, of being under scrutiny, of possibly encountering men like Hayes without Quincy's protection, made her stomach knot with anxiety. "Thank you, Mrs. Hollister," she said carefully. "But I think I'll stay here. Mr. Irving and I have an understanding." The older woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "As you wish. But if you change your mind, the offer stands." She patted Julia's hand. "And if you ever need to talk woman to woman, my door is always open." After the dinner guests departed, Julia and Quincy washed the dishes together in companionable silence. The day had been exhausting in its way, meeting so many new people, being the center of attention, but also oddly satisfying. For the first time in years, Julia felt as though she might belong somewhere. "You handled that well," Quincy said as they finished. "Mrs. Hollister can be a bit overwhelming at first, but she means well." "She offered to let me stay with her until the wedding," Julia admitted. "For propriety's sake." Quincy's hand stilled on the dish he was drying. "Is that what you want?" Julia shook her head. "No, unless my presence here complicates things for you." "Not at all," Quincy said quickly. "This is your home now, Julia, or it can be if you want it to be." Their eyes met across the kitchen, and Julia felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with anxiety. "I'd like that," she said softly. That evening they sat on the porch again, watching as stars appeared one by one in the vast desert sky. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote and the rustle of wind through sage. "Quincy," Julia said finally, gathering her courage, "there are things about my past that I haven't told you, things that might change how you see me." Quincy turned to her, his expression serious in the fading light. "Julia, we all have pasts, things we've done, things done to us. What matters to me is the person you are now and the future we might build together." "But what if, whatever happened in Boston," Quincy interrupted gently, "it's behind you now. When you're ready to tell me, I'll listen. And nothing you could say would make me think less of you." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "You can't promise that." "I can," he said simply. "Because I've seen enough of who you are these past days to know your character. You're strong, Julia, stronger than maybe even you realize." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken histories between them. "When I was 20, Quincy said suddenly, "I killed a man." Julia's head snapped up, startled by the confession. "It was during a raid," Quincy continued, his voice steady but distant. "Apache. They'd been pushed to desperation by the army, and our ranch was in their path. My father was away in town. It was just me and Mother and our hand, old Charlie." He paused, lost in memory. "Charlie died first. I got Mother to the root cellar, but one of them found us. He had a knife. I had my father's pistol." Julia remained silent, sensing he needed to finish. "I don't regret it," Quincy said. "I'd do it again to protect my family." But I've never forgotten his face. He was young, probably no older than I was. He turned to Julia. "We all have things we carry, Julia, things that shaped us. When you're ready to share your burdens, I'll help carry them, but I won't ask you to show me your scars until you're ready." In that moment, looking at his face silvered by starlight, Julia felt something shift inside her, a wall beginning to crumble, a door starting to open. "Thank you," she whispered. The next morning marked the beginning of what would become their routine. Quincy rose at dawn to start chores, and Julia prepared breakfast. After eating together, Quincy would leave to work with the ranch hands, while Julia tended to the house, the garden, and the chickens. Each day brought small revelations as they learned to navigate life together. Julia discovered Quincy was meticulous about his tools but careless with his socks. Quincy learned that Julia hummed when she cooked and loved to read in the afternoons when her chores were done. By the end of the first week, Julia's face had healed enough that the bruises were barely visible. The nightmares that had plagued her in Boston came less frequently, though she still woke occasionally in a cold sweat. Heart racing, on her 8th day at the ranch, Julia decided it was time to learn to ride. She found Quincy in the barn, brushing down thunder after the morning's work. "I'd like to try riding today," she announced. "If you have time to teach me." Quincy looked up, surprised but pleased. "Are you sure? No rush, you know." "I'm sure," Julia said firmly. "If I'm going to live on a ranch, I should know how to ride a horse." Quincy grinned, setting aside the brush. "All right then. Let's introduce you to Daisy proper." The gentle mare regarded Julia with liquid brown eyes as Quincy showed her how to approach, how to let the horse get accustomed to her scent and voice. "Horses can sense fear," he explained, "so try to stay calm. Daisy hears about the gentlest mount you could ask for, but she still needs to feel you're confident." Julia swallowed her nervousness and stroked Daisy's velvety nose, murmuring softly as Quincy had shown her. The mare's ears flicked forward attentively. "She likes you," Quincy said, clearly pleased. "Let's get her saddled and we'll start with the basics." The lesson took place in the smaller corral, with Quincy leading Daisy on a long rein while Julia learned to sit properly, to hold the reins, to give commands with her voice and knees. "That's it," Quincy encouraged as Julia completed her 3rd circuit without clutching the saddle horn. "You're a natural." Julia laughed, exhilarated by the new experience. "I don't know about that, but I like it." They were so engrossed in the lesson that neither noticed the approaching rider until he was at the corral fence. "Well, ain't this sweet?" drawled a familiar voice. Julia's head snapped up, and Daisy sensed her sudden tension, sidling nervously. Quincy moved quickly to steady the horse, positioning himself between Julia and Luke Hayes. "You're trespassing again, Hayes," Quincy said, his voice dangerously quiet. Hayes leaned on the fence, apparently unconcerned. "Just delivering a message from Henderson. He wants to talk about water rights for the eastern section." His gaze shifted to Julia, a smirk playing at his lips. "Your little lady's looking better. Bruises healing up nice." Julia felt heat rush to her face, partly embarrassment, partly anger at his insinuation. "You've delivered your message," Quincy said coldly. "Now get off my land." "Touchy," Hayes commented, straightening. "Just being neighborly. Henderson wants to meet tomorrow at noon." He tipped his hat mockingly at Julia. "Madam, enjoy your riding lesson." He sauntered back to his horse and mounted with fluid grace, riding away without a backward glance. "I don't like that man," Julia said, her hands trembling slightly on the reins. "That makes 2 of us," Quincy agreed grimly. He helped her dismount, his hands gentle on her waist. "I'm sorry about that. I should have posted one of the boys at the road." "It's not your fault," Julia said, smoothing her skirt, "and I won't let him ruin my first riding lesson." She managed a smile. "I really did enjoy it." Quincy's expression softened. "You did well. A few more lessons, and you'll be riding out with me to check the herd." As they walked back to the barn leading Daisy, Julia found herself leaning slightly into Quincy's solid presence beside her. Each day, she found herself more drawn to this quiet, steady man who had offered her protection without demanding anything in return. That evening after dinner, as they sat together by the fire, Julia finally gathered her courage. The time had come for honesty. "Quincy," she began, setting aside the mending she'd been working on, "I need to tell you about Boston, about what really happened." Quincy set down the bridle he'd been repairing and gave her his full attention. "I'm listening." Julia took a deep breath, her hands twisting in her lap. "I told you my father died and I became a governess. That was true. What I didn't tell you was that the family who employed me had a son, Roger Blackfield." The name still tasted bitter on her tongue. "He paid me attention, said he loved me, wanted to marry me." Quincy remained silent, his face unreadable in the firelight. "I believed him," Julia continued, her voice growing softer. "I was young and alone, and he was handsome and charming. He promised marriage, and I—" She faltered, then forced herself to continue. "I shared his bed. When his parents discovered our relationship, they were furious not because of what he'd done, but because they had higher aspirations for their son than a penniless governess." She paused, gathering strength for the hardest part. "Roger changed after that. He became controlling, jealous. The first time he hit me was when I spoke to another man at church." The memories flooded back, the shock of that first blow, the tearful apologies that followed, her own bewilderment and shame. "I should have left then, but I had nowhere to go. And he always apologized, promised it would never happen again." "But it did," Quincy said quietly. Julia nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Again and again. And then I discovered I was with child." Quincy's expression shifted, a flash of something unreadable crossing his features. "When I told him, he beat me so badly I lost the baby," Julia whispered, the words torn from her. "The family's doctor was called. He saved my life, but he told the Blackfields everything. They wanted to avoid scandal, so they paid me to disappear. That money brought me here." She wiped at her tears with trembling fingers. "I've deceived you, Quincy. I'm not. I'm not the innocent woman you thought you were corresponding with. I understand if you want to call off our arrangement." The silence that followed seemed endless. Julia couldn't bring herself to look at Quincy's face, afraid of what she might see there: disgust, disappointment, rejection. Then she felt his calloused hand gently cover hers. "Julia," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "look at me." She raised her eyes reluctantly, braced for condemnation. Instead, she saw only compassion and a deep, smoldering anger that she instinctively understood was not directed at her. "If that man were standing here now," Quincy said, his voice tight with controlled fury, "I'd kill him with my bare hands for what he did to you." A sob escaped Julia's throat. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," Quincy continued. "Nothing. That man, that monster, is the one who should be ashamed, not you, but the baby," Julia whispered. "I lost our child." "He took that from you," Quincy corrected gently. "Just as he took your trust, your sense of safety." "None of that was your doing, Julia." He moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking both her hands in his. "I meant what I said that first night. Never again. No one will hurt you like that again while I draw breath, and as for our arrangement—" He squeezed her hands gently. "The only thing that's changed is that I admire you even more, knowing what you've overcome." Julia stared at him in disbelief. "You still want to marry me, knowing everything?" "More than ever," Quincy said simply. "If you'll still have me." The dam broke then, and Julia wept not the silent tears she taught herself to shed in Roger's house, but deep, cleansing sobs that shook her entire body. Quincy moved to sit beside her on the small sofa, gathering her against his chest, his hand stroking her back as she purged years of pain and shame. When the storm passed, Julia found herself still held in Quincy's strong arms, her head resting against his shoulder. She should have felt embarrassed by such an emotional display, but instead she felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. "I'm sorry," she murmured, pulling back slightly to wipe her face. "I've soaked your shirt." "It needed washing anyway," Quincy said with a gentle smile. He hesitated, then asked, "Do you think you could be happy here, Julia?" "With me?" She looked up at him. This man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect, who had listened to her darkest secrets without judgment. In his steady gaze, she saw something she had almost stopped believing in: hope for a future free of fear. "Yes," she said softly, "I think I could be very happy here." Quincy's smile deepened, reaching his eyes. "Then we'll speak to the preacher when he comes through next week." He stood, helping her to her feet. "It's getting late, you should rest." As they said their goodnights, Quincy hesitated at his bedroom door. "Julia," he said quietly, "thank you for trusting me with your story. I know it wasn't easy." Julia nodded, a strange new feeling of peace settling over her. "Thank you for listening, and for not turning away." "Never," Quincy promised. The next morning, Julia woke feeling as though she'd been reborn. The weight of secrets no longer pressed upon her chest, and for the first time in years she felt truly seen and accepted. As she dressed and pinned her hair, she studied her reflection in the small mirror. The bruises had faded to nearly nothing, but more striking was the change in her eyes, clearer now, more present. At breakfast, there was a new ease between her and Quincy. Something had shifted last night, deepened. Trust, freely given and received. "I need to ride over to the rocking H this morning," Quincy said as they washed the breakfast dishes together. Henderson's message seemed genuine enough despite the messenger. "Will you be gone long?" Julia asked, trying to keep the note of anxiety from her voice. Quincy shook his head. "A few hours at most. Elmer and the boys will be working the south pasture. They'll hear if you fire the rifle." He hesitated. "Would you rather I send word to postpone?" Julia considered for a moment, then straightened her shoulders. "No, this is your livelihood. I won't let my fears interfere with that." Quincy studied her face, then nodded. "All right, but stay alert and keep the rifle handy." After he left, Julia busied herself with chores, finding comfort in the routine tasks. She collected eggs from the henhouse, weeded the vegetative garden, and churned butter from the cream that had been setting since the previous day. Around mid-morning, as she was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her heart quickened, and she moved swiftly toward the house where the rifle waited. Before she could reach the porch, a rider came around the side of the house. To her immense relief, it wasn't Luke Hayes, but a young woman astride a dappled mare. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with copper-red hair peeking from beneath a wide-brimmed hat and freckles scattered across her sun-browned face. "You must be Miss Adams," the woman called cheerfully, reining her horse to a stop. "I'm Abigail Wilson, Dr. Wilson's daughter." She dismounted with the ease of someone who'd been riding since childhood. "I hope I'm not intruding. Father was in this direction seeing to the Martinez baby, and I thought I'd pay a call while he works. Mrs. Hollister mentioned you'd arrived." "Please, call me Julia," Julia said, relaxing slightly. "And you're not intruding at all. I was just hanging laundry." Abigail smiled brightly. "Let me help, and we can get acquainted. I've been dying to meet you. We don't get many new faces in Castle Dome, especially not ladies." Together they hung the remaining laundry, and Julia found herself warming to Abigail's straightforward manner and easy conversation. Unlike Mrs. Hollister's somewhat overwhelming presence, Abigail's company was refreshing. "You'll come to town for the social next month, won't you?" Abigail asked as they moved to the porch with glasses of cold well water. "It's not much compared to what you might be used to in the East, but we managed to have a good time. Dancing, food, gossip, the essentials." Julia smiled. "I'd like that, though I'm not sure when exactly the wedding will be. The preacher comes through next week, I understand." "Reverend Hollister, yes," Abigail confirmed. "Oh, but you must let me help with wedding preparations. There's so little excitement here, and a wedding is just the thing to lift everyone's spirits." As they chatted, Julia learned that Abigail had been born in Castle Dome, had never traveled further east than Tucson, and hungered for stories of Boston and the world beyond Arizona territory. "Father wants me to marry Tom Peterson, the general store owner's son," Abigail confided, rolling her eyes. "He's nice enough, but duller than dishwater. I want adventure before I settle down with someone who thinks ordering a new type of canned goods is exciting." Julia laughed, surprised by how good it felt to simply talk with another woman close to her own age. "Adventure can be overrated," she said, thinking of her own painful journey. "Sometimes quiet and steady isn't such a bad thing." Abigail studied her with sudden perception. "Those bruises, they weren't from the stagecoach journey, were they?" Julia tensed, but something in Abigail's frank, non-judgmental gaze encouraged honesty. "No," she admitted. "They weren't." Abigail nodded as though confirming a suspicion. "I thought not. Father sees it sometimes women who have been hurt by the men who should protect them." She reached across to squeeze Julia's hand. "Quincy Irving's a good man, one of the best in these parts. You're safe with him." "I believe I am," Julia said softly. They were still talking when Quincy returned shortly after noon, looking tired but satisfied. "Miss Wilson," he greeted Abigail with a tip of his hat. "This is an unexpected pleasure." "I was just keeping your bride-to-be company," Abigail said, rising, "and inviting her to the social next month." She gathered her hat. "I should find Father. He's probably wondering where I've gotten to." After seeing Abigail off, Quincy joined Julia on the porch. "That was nice of her to visit," he commented. "Abigail's a good sort, bit wild for these parts, but good-hearted." "I liked her," Julia said. "She's refreshingly direct," Quincy chuckled. "That's one way to put it. Her father despairs of her ever settling down, but secretly I think he's proud of her spirit." He stretched, wincing slightly. "Meeting with Henderson went well. We worked out the water rights issue without much fuss." "And Hayes," Julia couldn't help asking, "kept his distance," Quincy said, his expression darkening slightly. "Henderson mentioned he's been spending too much time in the saloon lately, getting into scrapes. I wouldn't be surprised if he moves on soon." Men like that don't usually stay in one place long. The thought of Hayes leaving the area lifted a weight from Julia's shoulders that she hadn't fully acknowledged was there. The day of Reverend Hollister's arrival dawned clear and warm. In the week since Julia's confession, she and Quincy had settled into a comfortable routine, growing closer with each passing day. They hadn't discussed the specifics of their wedding, whether it would happen immediately or whether they would wait, but the question hung in the air between them, ripe with possibility. The Reverend was expected around midday, and Julia found herself growing increasingly nervous as the morning progressed. She changed her dress twice, finally settling on the blue one that Quincy had once commented brought out the color of her eyes. "You look beautiful," Quincy said when she emerged from her room. He'd clearly made an effort himself, wearing a clean shirt with his best vest, his hair neatly combed. "Thank you," Julia said, a blush warming her cheeks. "Do I look respectable enough to be a rancher's wife. Quincy's expression softened. You look perfect, but Julia. He hesitated. We don't have to do this today, you know. The Reverend comes through every month. We could wait if you're not ready. Julia considered his words, searching her heart. Was she ready to bind herself to this man, to this life? The answer came with surprising clarity. I'm ready, she said simply. If you are, the smile that broke across Quincy's face was like sunrise. I've been ready since you stepped down from that stagecoach. The Reverend arrived precisely at noon, accompanied by Mrs. Hollister, who immediately took charge of the situation. We can't have a wedding without witnesses, she declared, sending Quincy to fetch Elmer and whichever of the hands could be spared. She'd brought a small cake and bustled about setting it on the table while the Reverend greeted Julia with genuine warmth. Mrs. Hollister tells me you've settled in well, he said, his kind eyes taking in her healed face approvingly. Quincy's a fortunate man. I'm the fortunate one, Julia replied honestly. By 1 o'clock, the small house was as full as it had ever been. Elmer, Bill, and young Danny had cleaned up as best they could on short notice. Abigail Wilson had somehow gotten word of the event and arrived with her father. Even the Peterson family from the general store had closed up shop to attend. The ceremony itself was brief, but meaningful. Standing before the Reverend in the main room of what was now truly her home, with Quincy's warm hand holding hers, Julia spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice. When Quincy promised to love, honor, and protect her, his eyes never leaving hers, she believed him with every fiber of her being. I now pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Hollister declared. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. The small gathering erupted in cheers and congratulations. Mrs. Hollister wiped away a tear, though she'd deny it later. Abigail hugged Julia fiercely, whispering, "You deserve this happiness," in her ear. The celebration continued through the afternoon, with food and drink flowing freely. Someone had brought a fiddle, and the furniture was pushed back for dancing. Julia found herself passed from partner to partner, first Quincy, then Dr. Wilson, then a blushing Danny Whitaker, who apologized profusely for stepping on her toes. As the sun began to set, the guests gradually departed, leaving Julia and Quincy alone for the first time as husband and wife. The house seemed strangely quiet after the day's festivities. "Well, Mrs. Irving," Quincy said, taking her hand gently, "how does it feel?" "Wonderful," Julia replied truthfully. "And a bit overwhelming," Quincy nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It's been a big day." He hesitated, then added, "Julia, I want you to know, I don't expect anything. We can take our time, find our way together." The tenderness in his voice brought tears to her eyes. This man, this good man, was now her husband, not by force or coercion, but by choice, her choice. "Quincy," she said softly, stepping closer to him, "take me to our room." His eyes darkened, but still he hesitated. "Are you sure?" In answer, Julia rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. It was their first real kiss. They had exchanged only the briefest, most proper of kisses during the ceremony, and it held all the promise of their future together. That night, in the darkness of what had been his room and was now theirs, Quincy showed Julia what love between a man and a woman was meant to be: gentle, considerate, mutual. His touch erased the memory of Roger's brutality, replacing it with tenderness and respect. When tears came to her eyes, they were tears of healing, of joy rediscovered. "I love you," Quincy whispered in the darkness, his arms around her, her head resting on his chest. "I think I've loved you since I read your first letter." Julia tilted her face up to his. "And I love you. I never thought I could feel this way again, safe, cherished." Quincy's arms tightened around her. "Always, Julia, for as long as I live." As she drifted toward sleep, Julia marveled at the journey that had brought her here from terror and despair in Boston to hope and love in the Arizona desert. The path had been painful, but lying here in her husband's arms, she wouldn't change a moment of it. Spring gave way to the heat of summer, and Julia blossomed like the desert flowers that briefly transformed the landscape after the rare rains. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm of work and companionship that suited her perfectly. She learned to ride well enough to accompany Quincy on his rounds, her confidence growing with each outing. She planted an expanded garden, adding herbs and flowers to the practical vegetables. She became friends with Abigail Wilson, who visited often, bringing books from her mother's lending library. Most importantly, she and Quincy grew closer with each passing day, their love deepening as they learned each other's habits, preferences, strengths, and weaknesses. Julia discovered that Quincy had a surprising talent for wood carving, creating delicate figures in the evenings by the fire. Quincy learned that Julia had a beautiful singing voice, though she was shy about using it except when she thought herself alone. Their physical relationship flourished as well, as Julia shed the last of her fears and inhibitions, discovering the joy of intimacy with a partner who valued her pleasure as much as his own. In August, as the hottest days of summer gripped the desert, Julia missed her monthly course. At first, she dismissed it as the result of the heat or perhaps the changes in her diet. But when a second month passed, she could no longer ignore the possibility. She waited until they were alone after dinner one evening, the day's work done. Quincy relaxed in his chair by the fire. "Quincy," she said, her voice catching slightly, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the piece of wood he was carving, concern immediately crossing his features. "What is it?" "Are you all right?" Julia nodded, a smile trembling on her lips. I'm quite sure, actually. We're going to have a baby." Quincy went perfectly still, the carving knife frozen in his hand. "A baby," he repeated as though testing the word. "Yes," Julia confirmed, suddenly nervous. Is that all right?" The carving and knife clattered to the floor as Quincy rose and crossed to her in 2 strides, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. "All right, Julia, it's wonderful." His voice was rough with emotion. "A baby, our baby." The joy in his face dispelled her last worry. She'd been afraid, deep down, that the knowledge of her previous pregnancy, the child she'd lost, would shadow this new life. But there was only happiness in Quincy's expression as he knelt before her, placing a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "Hello there, little one," he said softly. "Your mama and I are very happy to meet you." Tears of happiness spilled down Julia's cheeks as she covered his hand with her own. This was healing of a kind she hadn't known. She needed the chance to welcome a child with joy instead of fear, with a partner who would protect rather than harm. The months that followed were filled with preparations and anticipation. Quincy insisted that Julia rest more, taking on additional chores himself or assigning them to the ranch hands. He expanded their bedroom to make room for a cradle, which he crafted himself from pine, carving intricate designs of desert animals and plants along the rails. Word of their expected child spread quickly through the small community of Castle Dome. Mrs. Hollister organized a gathering of women to prepare blankets and baby clothes. Dr. Wilson visited regularly to check on Julia's health, pronouncing her and the baby to be doing well. Even Luke Hayes's shadow had receded from their lives. True to Quincy's prediction, Hayes had moved on after a particularly bad night at the saloon had resulted in his dismissal from the Rocking H. As winter approached and Julia's body changed to accommodate their growing child, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The bruises that had marked her arrival were long gone, replaced by the glow of pregnancy and happiness. The fears that had haunted her had faded. Though not disappeared entirely, she suspected some shadows would always remain, but they no longer defined her. One crisp December evening, as they sat by the fire, Quincy's hand resting on her rounded belly, feeling the baby kick, Julia gave voice to her reflections. "A year ago, I didn't think I would ever be happy again," she said softly. "I certainly never imagined this." Quincy's hand moved in a gentle circle on her stomach. "Life has a way of surprising us, sometimes in terrible ways, but sometimes." He smiled as the baby kicked particularly forcefully, in wonderful ones. "When you touched my face that first day," Julia continued, "when you promised never again, I wanted so badly to believe you, but I was afraid to hope." "And now?" Quincy asked, his eyes intent on hers. Julia leaned forward to kiss him softly. "Now I know what it is to be truly loved. To be safe. To belong." Their son was born on a clear January morning in 1879, with Dr. Wilson attending and Abigail assisting. After hours of labor, Julia's triumphant cry mingled with the lusty wail of new life as Quincy paced anxiously in the main room, nearly wearing a path in the floorboards. "You have a son, Mr. Irving," Dr. Wilson announced, opening the bedroom door, his face weary but smiling. "A strong, healthy boy, and your wife is doing well." Quincy's legs nearly buckled with relief as he hurried into the bedroom. Julia lay propped against pillows, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion but radiant with joy. In her arms, wrapped in one of Mrs. Hollister's blankets, was a tiny red-faced bundle. "Quincy," she whispered, "come meet your son." He approached the bed as though in a dream, perching carefully on the edge to peer at the infant. A shock of dark hair, a button nose, tiny perfect fingers curled against his cheek. "He's beautiful," Quincy said, his voice breaking. "Just like his mother. Would you like to hold him?" Julia asked. With infinite care, Quincy took the small bundle from Julia's arms, cradling his son against his chest. The baby's eyes opened briefly newborn blue, but with a hint of what might become his father's hazel before closing again in sleep. "What shall we call him?" Quincy asked, unable to take his eyes off his son's face. Julia had been considering names for months, but in this moment only one felt right. "Robert," she said, "after my father, Robert Quincy Irving." "Robert Quincy Irving," Quincy repeated, testing the name. "It's a good name, a strong name." He bent to kiss his son's forehead, then leaned forward to kiss Julia tenderly. "Thank you," he whispered against her lips. "For him, for us, for everything." As spring returned to the desert, bringing with it a riot of wildflowers and the busy season on the ranch, little Robert, already nicknamed Bobby by everyone except Mrs. Hollister, who insisted on proper names, thrived. At 3 months old, he was a cheerful, sturdy infant with his father's hazel eyes and his mother's dimpled smile. Julia had recovered well from the birth, regaining her strength and energy. She'd taken to motherhood with a natural grace that surprised even her, finding deep joy in the simple routines of caring for Bobby. One warm April afternoon, as Julia sat on the porch nursing Bobby, she spotted a lone rider approaching the house. Her first instinct was still wariness, a holdover from darker days, but she relaxed when she recognized Abigail Wilson's distinctive red hair. "Julia," Abigail called, waving as she approached. "And little Bobby too, perfect. I was hoping to see both of you." She dismounted in a flurry of skirts and bounded up the porch steps, bending to coo at the baby before settling in the chair beside Julia. "How's my favorite godson today?" she asked, tickling Bobby's foot as he nursed. "Growing like a weed," Julia replied with a smile. "And hungry all the time, according to his father. Speaking of Quincy," Abigail said, glancing around, "where is he? I have news I want to share with both of you." "He's out with the boys moving cattle to the high pasture," Julia said. "Should be back for dinner. Will you stay?" Abigail nodded eagerly. "Try and keep me away, especially if you're making that corn bread of yours." As they chatted, catching up on the small news of Castle Dome, Julia noticed an unusual energy about her friend, a barely contained excitement. "All right," she said finally as she settled a sleeping Bobby in his cradle. "What's this news you're bursting to tell? I can see you're about to explode with it." Abigail's face split in a wide grin. "I'm leaving Castle Dome in 2 weeks." Julia's heart sank at the thought of losing her closest friend, but she forced a smile. "Leaving? Where are you going?" "San Francisco," Abigail announced triumphantly. "Father finally agreed. I'm going to stay with his sister, Aunt Margaret, and attend the women's college there." "Can you believe it? Me, a college student?" Julia's smile turned genuine at her friend's obvious joy. "That's wonderful, Abigail. You'll be magnificent. But why the sudden change? Your father's been against it for so long." Abigail's expression turned mischievous. "Well, it might have something to do with Tom Peterson finally getting engaged to Sarah Miller. Father has finally accepted that I'm not going to settle for being a storekeeper's wife in Castle Dome." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "And between you and me, I think he's a little proud that I want to study medicine like him." "You'll make a wonderful doctor," Julia said sincerely, "though we'll miss you terribly." "I'll write every week," Abigail promised, "and I'll be back for visits." "You'll have to keep me updated on Bobby's progress and any brothers or sisters that might come along." Julia blushed slightly. She and Quincy had already discussed expanding their family, though they planned to wait until Bobby was a bit older. "And you have to promise to come visit me in San Francisco someday," Abigail continued. "Both of you, all of you. The city is supposed to be magnificent." "We will," Julia promised. "Once Bobby's older, I'd love to see the ocean again." When Quincy returned home that evening, dusty and tired from a long day's work, he was genuinely pleased by Abigail's news. "San Francisco, eh?" he said, bouncing Bobby on his knee after dinner. "That's quite an adventure, Miss Wilson. Your father must be proud." "Terrified is more like it," Abigail laughed. "But he's trying to be supportive." As they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson, Julia felt a profound contentment settle over her. This was her life now, her husband, her child, their home, their friends. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself growing up in Boston, but it was richer, deeper, more meaningful than anything she could have dreamed. Later that night, as she and Quincy lay together in the darkness, Bobby sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby, she voiced her thoughts. "I was thinking about my journey here," she said softly, her head resting on Quincy's chest. "About how frightened I was, how uncertain of the future." Quincy's hand stroked her hair gently. "And now," Julia smiled in the darkness, "now I know that sometimes the most painful journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations." Quincy's arms tightened around her. "I thank God every day that your journey brought you to me, Julia Irving." "As do I," she whispered, lifting her face for his kiss. "As do I." In the years that followed, the Double I Ranch prospered under Quincy and Julia's careful stewardship. They weathered drought and flood, good markets and bad, always together, always stronger for the challenges they faced. Bobby grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's quiet strength and his mother's quick intelligence. When he was 4, he welcomed a sister, Elizabeth Rose, into the family. 2 years later, another son, James, completed their family. Julia never forgot the lessons of her painful past, but they no longer shadowed her days. Instead, they gave her a deep appreciation for the joy she had found and the strength to face whatever difficulties arose. Castle Dome grew slowly but steadily. eventually boasting a proper school where Bobby and his siblings received their early education. Abigail Wilson completed her medical training and returned to practice alongside her aging father, becoming the first female doctor in Yuma County. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Quincy surprised Julia with a trip to San Francisco, leaving the children in the capable care of Mrs. Hollister and Elmer Jenkins, who had become like family over the years. Standing on the cliffs above the Pacific, the wind whipping her hair and the vast ocean stretching to the horizon, Julia felt a sense of completion. The frightened, bruised young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Castle Dome a decade ago would hardly recognize the confident, joyful woman she had become. Quincy came to stand beside her, his arms slipping around her waist. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Irving." Julia smiled up at him, at the face that had grown even dearer to her over the years. "I was just thinking about beginnings and endings, about how what I thought was the end of my life in Boston was really just the beginning." Quincy nodded, understanding as he always did. And a fine beginning it was, too. Julia leaned into his solid warmth, still grateful after all these years for the safety and love she had found with him. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day, when you touched my bruises?" "Never again," Quincy said softly, his eyes holding hers. "And you kept that promise," Julia said. "Every day in every way that matters." Quincy bent to kiss her, a kiss that still held all the tenderness of their first and all the depth of their shared years. "Always," he promised against her lips, "for as long as I live." And standing there on the edge of the continent, with the man who had healed her heart, Julia knew with bone-deep certainty that some promises were meant to last forever.